Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you so much for coming to the talk. I hope that I will be able to live up to the abstract I wrote for it. So when we think about societies, right, if we try to think about what is a society, it can get a little bit messy, but perhaps we can use a simple definition, the simplest definition that I found, and this is particularly for human societies, is that you have to have a community or grouping of individuals that have some shared traditions, that have some institutions, and I'm going to think about these as broadly like some sort of collective organization. It could be institutions like the police, but it could be more broadly, people having like a town council. And they have to have shared collective activities and shared collective interests, okay? Now, if I take the exact same definition, actually without changing anything else, I could just as easily apply it to animal societies. So one of the more interesting things that social scientists and anthropologists have discovered, and biologists over the last decade or 2 decades, is that if you take primate societies, but not only, you can also look at whales and you can also look at some birds, they have elements of what we call culture in human societies. So even though for the longest time human culture was considered to be unique, and in some sense it is, some rudiments of human culture, including traditions, will exist in some of these other societies. So actually I could import the same definition. I can actually go even simpler. If I get rid of traditions, which would be a little bit complicated to argue what exactly they are, insect societies satisfy all the other elements of this definition. They are collectively organized, they have collective activities, and they obviously have collective interests. And I'm going to spend more time talking about ants and bees. And certainly I could try to push it a little bit, if you'll allow me, and go even as far as multicellular groups, such as an elephant, one of my favorite animals, other than my daughter. So multicellular groups are societies of cells, right? They have organization, they have collective interests, there is a fitness of the collective, and there certainly are collective activities whereby your immune cells are ganging up together on any viruses that come in, and so on and so forth. So what I try, usually when if you want to think about the pinnacle of any one of these societies, then we'll have a gorgeous picture like this, where we can think about the most wonderful and beautiful achievements of human society, but similarly contrast them to some absolutely mind-boggling achievements of some of these other societies. I like to think that those chimps are gossiping there. But in principle, up there, perhaps not quite as extraordinary as San Marco, here you have a cathedral termite mound. So these are termites, millions of termites that build this extraordinary creation, and it's not just an accident. There is a field full of these cathedral mounds, and they all look like these spectacular constructions. Those there are even perhaps more shocking because that's an army ant bivouac in the left-hand corner. They don't have any structure. These are nomadic ants that move around. They don't have any structure that they actually build, but they have to protect and enclose their queen and their babies. And the way they do that is by creating this extraordinary castle-like structure out of their own bodies. So they're basically making the architecture out of their own bodies. It's a living cathedral. And of course, you have plants that have reached extraordinary complexity, like a redwood tree here, and again, the elephant. So if I start there, it's a little bit hard to focus on the nature of societies, and I'm more distracted by these extraordinary feats of complexity. So what I usually do is I take a step back and I say, perhaps I shouldn't look at some of these. Perhaps I should look at others that exist right now, but they are much simpler, right? Not every plant is a redwood tree. There we have some bryophytes, which are some of the simplest, perhaps the simplest plants. They're like mosses. Not every animal is an elephant. This is the simplest animal we know. Unlike your typical elephant, which will have about 4 quadrillion cells, this one has about 4,000 cells. It's a placozoan. Not all ants can do those extraordinary things because some of them are extremely small and usually live in groups of about 20 individuals or 100 individuals. There they are trying to figure out where food is. There's one little bit of food up there on the plate, and it's going to try to keep doing that. And as I mentioned, right, not everything is this extraordinary architectural feat. And in principle, if you live in an area where paper wasps like to be, you will have seen these wonderful little paper wasp nests. And that's kind of how complicated it gets. These are orchid bees, and they have their interesting feature is that even though they look like they're doing something social, they are, in fact, the only social part of this is that these females together built this little structure. And after that, they're just minding their own business. They're laying their eggs, they're caring for their own eggs, so they're not actually behaving like a society beyond the initial phase of construction of the nest. And in fact, look at the ants. They discovered the food, and now they're making the pheromone trail, and everybody's going there to recruit. Everybody's being recruited to go get the food and bring it back to the larvae, which are on this tiny little petri dish. So in fact, if we try to do a catalog of all the different kinds of social behaviors, the diversity in terms of size and complexity organizational abilities and the impact that they have, the imprint that they have on the environment, all of them vary widely. And I think there's a lot to be learned from basically making these kinds of comparisons, where there is so much variation that we can try to understand what's in common, what's the actual essence of these societies. But, allow me one more slide of these beautiful examples to say that even these ones are too complicated in some sense, because what we have to compare them against is what used to be before such societies existed. And usually, again, in recent years, especially from genomics and phylogenomics efforts, we've been able to discover who the ancestors, what are the cousins of these societies, right? Whom should we compare them against? What should we imagine that the world was like when the first multicellular organism arose, or when the first wasp became social? Sure. As I told Andrea, Romanians are like Italians. We are perfectly happy to use our hands. So, I thought you were going to come tie them up. Anyway, yes, we have that joke too. I will not say it right now. Here's what we have up there. We have choanoflagellates. They are mostly unicellular, but under certain conditions, they can form a multicellular organism of size 16. It's not a lot to write home about. But they are the most recent, the closest cousin to the animals. Then in green, we see gonium, one of the closest relatives of plants. This is an alga, again, 16. Beautiful little cells there. They can have different arrangements depending on these different types, but you see, they're small. We're thinking small societies here. When things came up, when any one of these innovations started, it started in a pretty much unicellular or solitary world, and some little single cell or some single insect discovered something that allowed it to live with somebody else. Not a million somebody else's, just one, right? It probably had no ability to know what to do with that one other thing, right? But it was there, and maybe something came out of that, right? So that's how one has to basically imagine these incipient, these origins of multicellularity, of eusociality, whether we think about animals, whether we think about plants, and no matter how complex they have gotten, and certainly also if we think about people. And as I said, right, if you take culture and you try to break it apart into elements of culture, we certainly find rudiments in other species, but certainly something extraordinary has happened in human culture, right? It's the same story over and over. It's fairly easy, actually, to make such simple groups. But to get something as extraordinary as an elephant, a redwood tree, a human society, or an army ant colony, or a leafcutter ant colony, something more had to have happened, right? And this is where that cusp is where most of my research is, and that's where I try to find the essence or the nature of societies. So This hasn't happened many times. They are called major evolutionary transitions. These are the social transitions. There are other major evolutionary transitions. They're basically major because once they arose, once they actually occurred, they left an extraordinary impact on the rest of life, right? So the invention of DNA from RNA, or the emergence of DNA from RNA, the appearance of the first cells, the appearance of the invention of sex, all of these are moments that have punctuated the evolution of life. Social behaviors, when multicellularity arose, when new sociality arose, when human culture arose, also mark such distinct major evolutionary transitions. This is just a list of them. It doesn't matter very much, but just to say that they have been successful in taking over the world, but they have been rare. They don't happen very often. So clearly, something has to align somehow for these to have happened. But when they do happen, they take over the world. And one thing that I have here is a drawing from the naturalist E.O. Wilson, with whom I was very lucky to interact and who convinced me that ants are it. And I'll think about many different things, but I will always return to ants, did this back of the envelope calculation that if you take all of the multicellular, all of the animals in the Amazon forest, and you also take all of the Hymenoptera, which are the ants, wasps, and bees, and you calculate the total biomass of these two different groups, ants outweigh the vertebrates, okay? And so that was, he said, obviously, ants are the rulers. So if you feel like you see ants everywhere, it's because they really are everywhere, and they've been very successful at making a living in any kind of habitat. Okay. So I hope I've established some intrigue here about these major evolutionary transitions. What I do most of the time is I try to think about this conceptually and theoretically, and I take this comparative perspective. And I want to very, without belaboring the point, but for anyone who is not used to thinking about modeling, I make models which are basically schematic representations, like a map is a schematic representation, right? You get rid of details that you don't care about, and then you keep the details that are most important to orient yourself, right? A map of Venice will show me, if I'm a tourist in Venice, will show me all the road names and how to get to the water taxi, but it will not give me details about every single last name of every person that lives in every building block or every gelato place. I wish it did, but it doesn't. In any case, models are similar representations. We strip away the details that we think are not relevant to the question we try to ask, and we keep only the details that are relevant, and then we try to see mathematically, when we've stripped away that detail, if there is what we can learn about a particular question. So here, a very simple question you can ask about major evolutionary transitions is, let me take a solitary life cycle. Let's take something that looks like your solitary bee. Okay, this is a carpenter bee. If you live in wood houses, in places where there are carpenter bees, you will often find little shavings and drillings. It's because they love to drill holes. And when they drill holes, if you break that part of your wall, probably shouldn't, you will see basically larvae stacked with separations in between them. The mother comes back and feeds these larvae, but then eventually, once they've grown, everybody disperses and starts their own nest and drills their own holes somewhere else, okay? So that would be a solitary lifestyle. And I want to contrast that with a social lifestyle, but I want to be, again, thinking about very simple social lifestyles. I don't want to be thinking here about super complicated societies where I have a lot of sorts of diversity, from some individuals being younger, some being older, some being bigger, some being smaller, right? I don't want to have all of that because they didn't have all of that, right? So I want to be thinking about a mother and her daughters, whether it's a single cell or an ant or a wasp, right? It's going to be a mother and her daughters, and maybe some of those daughters stay behind at the nest. So how do I represent this? I say, well, maybe some mutation happened, something happened to that solitary mother, and one day when she laid those eggs there, one of those eggs stayed behind with a certain probability, and now there's two of them. And maybe, I want to account for every possibility. Maybe that happens again, and maybe there are 3, right? So I can keep growing these groups. And then I populate this virtual world with solitary individuals and with these kinds of groups that can be either solitary because they're just starting, or they can be of bigger sizes depending how many daughters have stayed at the nest, how big this probability is that they stay at the nest, and so on and so forth. And now why I'm saying that this is a very simple model is because I'm going to do basically what I'm going to assume here is that these ones can't do anything different. It's not like now there's 2 of them and they've discovered some sort of technology, right? They're not using tools. They're still doing the same thing as the solitary mother. They're still eating the same food. They still have the same predators. They still have the same parasites. They're still fighting for the same locations to make holes, right? So they're in the same environment. And ecologists have known for a long time, if you have 2 types, 2 species or 2 types that are in the same environment and they compete for the same resources and there's no difference between them, only one will succeed, right? So this very simple model will tell me when should I expect this to succeed and when should I expect that one to maintain its dominance over the world, okay? And so we can make, we can do very simple analyses and simulations and whatnot. But the takeaway that came out of models like this was that, excuse me, recovering from a cold. So one of the realizations, which I guess, if you think about it, should be fairly straightforward, is that whatever benefits being social gives you, it has to give it to you early in small group sizes. These don't have time to grow to 1,000 individuals before they can kick out the solitary ones that are really good at harnessing the resources in that environment, right? They have to somehow get some benefits at very small sizes, which is consistent with the fact that we know that all of these societies, when they took off, they were small. But what can possibly be happening in groups of 2 individuals or 3 individuals or 10 individuals that would be more than the sum of the parts, right? I don't know if you've heard this expression, right? But in principle, they have to do better as a group at making themselves into putting themselves into the next generation than that one individual, right? So per capita, if I have 10 individuals here, they have to be more than 10 individuals of those type, okay? All right, Flavio, when should I stop? Because I can talk about this stuff until tomorrow. Half an hour? Okay, very good. All right, so I hope this is clear, but by the way, I know it's a public lecture, but please feel free to interrupt me if you have questions that you feel are burning and you really want to ask them. So the prediction, this really important prediction, was that basically a very small group of individuals, which are very similar, mind you, right? They're daughters of the same mother, have to somehow be able to self-organize to do something a little bit better per capita, as a collective per capita than the individual solitary ancestor. And honestly, I set this one aside for about maybe 8 years because I could not imagine, right? I could not imagine exactly what they might be able to do. When they're so similar, you can't harness, for example, heterogeneities, right? Like I said, they are not bigger or smaller, and thus the bigger ones do this and the smaller ones do that, or older and younger, and thus the older ones have more experience, or better at this than better at that, right? We should assume that they are very similar. So exactly, I couldn't quite think what it was. And then I was lucky, I've been friends for a long time, but since basically that first model with a very good biologist at Rockefeller who is an entomologist who spends time collecting ants in the wild, but also has an extraordinary laboratory setup here, where each one of those little white things is a petri dish, and in each one of those, it's an ant colony. And these are ants who live in very small groups in the wild, so they live like about 20, 30, 100 of them at most, and so they don't mind being in small groups, and they don't mind growing in the lab, provided that they are fed. And then you can watch them lovingly, clearly, and after you do that for some time, you can try to understand what happens in these groups, right? So Daniel set this system up. And then we started to look together at basically, okay, let's put together one ant with its larva that it has to take care of. Let's put 2 ants with 2 larvae, so we're trying to standardize the work per ant, right? We don't want to make it easier by virtue of having more ants. We can put 4 ants, so every time I say here group size, that's the adult ants that are in the colony, but they are together with just as many larvae, so they can take care of them, right? We're assuming each one of these could have had an egg, or you know, that the production of eggs is proportional. And the question is, can they rear them successfully? So the highest colony growth that you can get is 1, because at most you will double the size of the colony. And so let's see what happens, he said, you know. Well, what happens is that when an ant is by herself, she mostly fails, actually. She's constantly trying to do stuff, and it's constantly not getting done, all right? If you have 2, it gets a little bit better. If you have 3 and 4, it gets a little bit better, but you know, soon enough, it gets as good as it gets, right? So by like 10 individuals, basically, you get almost the doubling of the colony, okay? And 12 and 16 are not better than 10, actually. I don't know why 10 is not there. So that was really surprising. I mean, as a theoretician, you live for these moments, right? Where you're like, somebody has actually been convinced to do this experiment, and then the experiment shows that, but we still didn't know what they were doing, and they don't look like much. As you saw the ones, you know, you can see them foraging or doing something, but they don't look like they're gonna build a whole structure there and you can have your aha moment, right? So, but what we did find is you could look in each one of these colonies and find the right metrics and discover that they had somehow, past colony size 8 or 6, self-organized into a rudimentary division of labor. And I call it rudimentary because this is one thing about working at the origins. Most of the metrics that we are accustomed to using for measuring things like division of labor are too, sophisticated in some sense to pick up on some of these rudimentary, some of the rudimentary stuff that might be happening. If you have 6 individuals in a colony, they can't actually become, this one is going to be a forager, you are going to take the trash out, I'm going to take care of the larvae. Everybody has to do a little bit of everything, because especially because things, you know, the needs of the colony will change around, right? And will change dynamically. And so, one of the things so what is actually then division of labor if they're not getting dedicated roles, is that what becomes conserved after size 6 or 8 is a rank hierarchy. So they're ordering, right? Everybody does a bit of everything, but you can definitely pinpoint the ant that looks more dedicated to foraging, and you can pinpoint the one that's more dedicated to nursing, or more dedicated to doing something else, okay? So it's this rank ordering that can't be established if you have too few, but once you have just enough, it becomes established, and it's maintained throughout the lifespan of that particular colony. And even if once their eggs hatch and their brood hatch and so on, you take away their brood and you give them new eggs, they will still continue in that same hierarchy, right? So that's pretty well established once they get into it. So that was really just wonderful, right? This is where the experimental part gave an answer that I could not have thought about 10 years ago. But then there was something else that was a little bit tricky there, because you see, ants have always been social. We don't have access to a solitary ancestor of the ants. Ants come from a wasp, and that wasp discovered eusociality and then gave rise to the ants. And so all ants that we have today, all ants that have ever existed, have always been social. Rudimentarily social, some of them, and super complex, others of them. But you know, one argument here could be, well, this is not how it would have worked back then. Maybe this is how it works now, because these are already social. And can you convince me that this is something that could have occurred without these organisms already being used to being ants, okay? And so this is where the modeling came into play again. I had a brilliant graduate student at the time, Chris Tokita. He was really interested in division of labor, and he made this very simple model. The model said the following thing: within the colony environment, there will be some needs, and we're going to call them stimuli. The stimulus that accumulates for babies are crying, the stimulus that accumulates for the food reserves are gone, the stimulus that accumulates for the trash is piling up and we can't see the door anymore, and that kind of thing, okay? And for each one of these particular stimuli, the ants are going to have some sort of internal threshold, something that the solitary one would have had too, right? The solitary individual had to also take care of the egg, feed it, clean it of parasites, go hunt for it and bring food back, right? Defend it from predators and so on and so forth, right? So all of these behaviors would have existed in the repertoire of the solitary individual, and there ought to have been some sort of threshold that tells that individual when to start doing a particular thing, right? There's a need. And we said, well, what if they all came? They came with these thresholds. Now they're part of a group. They don't know each other. They've never been together. And mind you, we're going to assume that they can't communicate. They don't even know that other ants are there. So we wanted to make a model that was so stripped away of anything social that there were no interactions among these individuals, except that they were all in the same nest and sensing the same environment. And when they did that, they had these thresholds, and so theta 1F there would be the threshold of that particular ant for foraging. So that is ant 1, and whatever the value of that threshold is that's the threshold that needs to be surpassed for this particular ant to start foraging. And then each one of them has their own threshold. If these thresholds are exactly identical, exactly the same, nothing can happen. But if these thresholds are even just a little bit different, right? They come from a distribution that can be really narrow, but they are a little bit different, consistent with the kind of individual variation that we now know exists even in clonal lines of cells, for example, right? Then if we have that, this model produces the specialization or division of labor. The red is the, I want to say model, and the black is the data. I kind of messed it up with this slide, don't have a legend there. But anyway, they can be in agreement. We can reproduce that same kind of specialization. And this rudimentary self-organization, the model confirmed that it does not actually require communication. It does not require social behavior. Here you can have a collective that has collective level benefits without being a social group yet. And that also was kind of mind-boggling stuff. Yes, very good, excellent. That now comes my example of how would you think about this, right? So they are all coupled, they are not communicating with each other, but indirectly they know whether stuff is being done because they are in that environment, right? So the way I like to think about this is that when I was in graduate school, I shared an apartment with 4 other mathematicians. We were not very neat, and we were never at the same time in the same place working on the same things, okay? And yet somehow we managed to live together for about 3 or 4 years, and the reason we managed to do that was not because we made a list of chores and everybody was assigned chores. Yeah, that would have been, we would have looked for a new apartment very quickly, but because we each had extraordinarily different thresholds for stuff that was necessary to get done. I am ashamed to admit that there is no pile of dishes of any size that will bother me as it accumulates in the sink. That used to be the case before I had kids. This is now a different story. But anyway, they didn't bother me. There was someone, one of my colleagues, who, if there was a fork, a dirty fork in the sink, he would go wash it because he couldn't stand the sink to have anything. There was one of them needed to have milk and orange juice or he couldn't get out of bed. All of us needed coffee or we couldn't get out of bed. And I couldn't stand a mess in the living room. And so between all of these different thresholds that we had for what bothered us the most, we didn't have the most amazing apartment in the world, but it was workable, okay? So that's how I think about this. They're not, the model system of division of labor, but they're making it work. So, So the model here was simply, the experiment gave us insight into what might be happening that I couldn't have really imagined before this, neither Daniel nor I. But the model came back to give us this additional insight that, just because we saw this in ants doesn't mean that it had to be ants who did it, that in principle, you can get it with something that doesn't actually need to communicate or coordinate in any way. The only information it's getting is via the environment. Okay. Now, the experiments were constrained by the fact that you couldn't put, I don't know, you saw here that these are very colorful. That's actually a barcode for the ants. All those paints there, they constitute barcodes, right? That's how the robot can identify. There's a robot that moves above these petri dishes and records the movements and tracks of all these ants. There's a limit to how much paint you can put on an ant, as you can tell. And so up to the point when we could do the experiment, the only thing that, size that they could get to was size 16. But the model obviously is not capped by that, so we thought, now this is our opportunity. We have this simple model. Let's just increase the group size. Let's see what happens if we throw in more ants. Nothing. That was a little bit disappointing. But in retrospect, it's actually kind of wonderful, right? How much would you expect to get out of just pure noise, basically, right? At the beginning, or you're lucky that you can have that little bit and that latent potential, this ability to harness what the ancestor was already able to do, but had to do it one at a time, sequentially, right? Now you have a bunch of individuals who can do it simultaneously just by virtue of having slightly different thresholds. But that doesn't take you that much farther, right? So Chris and I started to think about, well, what else could be happening here to get more? We know that some of them get more, so how can we get more? Obviously, increasing group size is not enough. But the interesting thing in biology is that there are often periods of stasis where something has been, in principle, either invented or is there, but nothing seems to be happening. And there's always a question of why. Why are there these periods of stasis? The thing is, during periods of stasis, there can be a lot of innovation that is not actually completely visible for different reasons that I will get to in an instant. But as soon as now you've displaced the solitary ancestor that you were competing with. You're there on your own, and you have these collectives, other things could be happening to you. For example, at some point, obviously, you will figure out that you are there with other individuals. This will happen repeatedly and repeatedly over evolutionary time. We're thinking here, thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, you are going to end up at some point discovering that there are others in the group, not just because the milk is getting replaced. And then you can start to have a social toolkit, right? It's there. Maybe it does nothing, but it's there. The other thing that can happen is that during long periods of time, your ecological opportunities might change. So for example, one of the things that we know from ants is that ants are actually much older than people thought. They evolved. Pretty much all the species that are today were there, but very, very, not something that if you visited that place at that time in late Cretaceous, you would say anything about ants, right? What happened afterwards, and took a lot of genomics, and this is a very beautiful paper in 2006 that I'm not an author on, but for anyone who's interested, they showed that ants are actually older, but the radiation, the diversification, the enormous growth in group sizes happened after flowering plants evolved. Okay. All of a sudden, flowering plants produced a lot more habitat complexity that they were able to use. They also, at that point, started to switch from being just predators, right? Let's say in the history of the humankind, like hunter-gatherers, right? Or nomadic tribes that would just go and hunt animals and maybe collect berries. They entered their agriculture phase. They started to actually tend insects. So what they're doing here is they're actually collecting sugar produced by these little green aphids. They're like their cows. They're milking these aphids, and that's a very, very nutrient-rich food. And so once these kinds of changes happened, groups could actually grow really large. So imagine Moreover, once you have a group that's big, no, you can't get interactions, everybody interacting with everybody else, everybody being in that same tiny, confined little room, right? And so information becomes structured at the very least because you're gonna have to start to build a nest. And so this is one of my favorite examples is Walter Schenkel. He's an entomologist in Florida. This is a harvester ant from Florida. This is the nest of a harvester ant, I'm sorry. It's taller than he is, and this is a cast of that nest. He just put I don't know, some concoction of things in there that he managed to extract it nicely, like this. And each one of these little plate-like things are chambers. Up there, it's very complex. That's where the foragers come, and they bring all of the seeds that they are harvesting. The queen and the larvae and the brood are very much lower. Nurses, so the ants that tend to the eggs and to the queen, are primarily below, his belt, let's say. And foragers basically never go that low in the colony, right? So interactions and information flow becomes structured almost by necessity as soon as you have a big group. So now if we put all of these things together, what Chris and I worked on was to say, well, what if we have something that we called interaction bias, for reasons that I'll discuss in a second, where you have a propensity to interact with those performing the same task. It doesn't mean you don't interact with the others. It just means that foragers are just a little bit more likely to interact with foragers than they are with nurses, and vice versa. And the other thing that we put in there is that now you are actually social, so you can respond to interactions with others, and we assume that one way by which you might be able to interact is that you might be able to modulate your threshold. Instead of assuming now that we all have different fixed thresholds, now we can assume that one of the consequences of being social is that you can modify your threshold in response to interactions that you have with others. And so one assumption you could make is that, for example, if two foragers meet with each other, they both become more forager-like. They both have a reduced threshold for that task of foraging. If a forager interacts with the nurse, they both become more similar to each other, right? So all kinds of interactions are possible. It's just that, on average, you're more likely to interact with one of the foragers if you're a forager, is more likely to interact with one of the nurses if you're a nurse. Let's take the same slightly disappointing plot from there and say, let's say at some point they would have discovered this mechanism, this social toolkit. What happens? That happens, thank goodness. These two mechanisms finally give us all the division of labor you could possibly want. It's basically maximal one. That's great. How does it work? Well, you can basically see it. Here, if you want to see it for different group sizes, you start to see basically a segregation, right? So the color indicates, the intensity of the color indicates how committed you are to that particular task. And so here they are becoming really forager-like, really nurse-like, okay? But I hope you notice something really odd about this. My favorite result from this paper is what happens at small group sizes. You are worse off. If you had a social toolkit, you are actually worse off than not having it, right? It erases those minute differences, right? You're interacting with because if you have 20 individuals or 10 individuals, even if you have a slightly higher propensity of meeting those that are of the same kind, you're still going to run into everybody else. That's the nature of small groups, and that homogenizes everyone, right? So this is actually quite interesting about the ordering of events that might have happened, that would have happened, right? If you discover a social toolkit before the ecological opportunity that gives you increase in group size, you lose maybe even what you already have gained in terms of division of labor, right? So there's some interesting ordering. So interaction bias and social influence increase division of labor, but only past the minimal group size. Okay. And what I want to point out here, to wrap up the ant story, is that there's something very interesting about mechanisms of self-organization and size of the group. There seem to be mechanisms that will only be obvious at certain sizes, and even if they're there, they can be absolutely invisible if you're not looking at the right size. So here's a really interesting example, again, very recent, to have established something like this. These are the same ants that I showed you earlier. This is the video that I showed earlier. This is it's called a group raid. They are considered to be primitive army ants because they're so small. And the way that they raid is that they want to eat other ants' brood. And they do that by doing these little trails. They find the brood, and then they recruit everyone, and they go in a line. Okay? That's very different from how army ants hunt. Army ants, with their many millions of individuals, do something that everyone, including humans, gets out of their way, okay? They move across the entire forest floor like they are, I mean, it's actually quite dramatic. I didn't find any videos, and anyway, I didn't find any videos, but they just move like a lawnmower, okay? And they just eat everything in their path. So that's considered a mass raid, and it has multiple branching points, and it looks a little bit like a phylogenetic tree. It just branches from a lot of different angles. What Daniel and his group did is he said, well, these are kind of primitive, and they've never been in big group sizes, but what if we put them in big group sizes? Because we have thousands of them in the lab. What happens, okay? As soon as they took this simple raider ant, and they put it with 5,000 other ants, started to get a stereotypical army ant raid, where by stereotypical I mean that they are able to find multiple sources of food. They don't go to each one of them sequentially. They actually branch out. They establish these like hotspots in the middle. Communication happens in very different ways, okay? It's the same mechanism because they're the same individuals, or maybe if there's an alternative possibility that they sense density and they exhibit a different behavior, but in principle the same individuals are able to look very different, doing the same task of foraging depending on the group size, right? So it's very important as we think about these origins, it's always important to take into account what group sizes we're thinking about, what mechanisms, and kind of try it factorially, everything with everything, what could have happened first, and try to see what the potential is for from each one of these paths. Okay, now as this was happening, we were super excited to announce to the world that interaction bias and social influence increase division of labor. We searched the literature, nothing about these mechanisms in the literature or in the animal literature, but sure enough, Chris found a paper from political scientists saying interaction bias and social influence are responsible for polarization. They are the root of basically everything that's bad. Because we have this tendency to interact with those who are more like us, and as we do, we create our echo chambers, and what looks like can lead to, very nice division of labor in ants actually creates, bubbles for individuals in human society. And so we started to be a little bit interested, because these are the kinds of, aha moments that you have as you make these comparative analysis across systems. The same mechanisms, divergent social consequences, but mind you, one of the really important takeaways, and we've done some work in human behavior, one of the important takeaways is to realize that even social insect colonies are not always trying to boost their heterogeneity, always trying to create things that are different. Oftentimes, they have to make decisions that require consensus, that require unanimity. And then it's very bad if everybody just kind of does its own thing, because, for example, one of the great examples is honeybee colonies often tend to outgrow they will grow until they will outgrow. This is in a tree trunk, right? And they will need to find a new place where they can move their nest. So you'll see them swarming because they're moving to another nest. Now, these honeybees, when they do that, they can be the way they find a new place to move is not that they just pack their bags and now everybody's going to go searching until they find something. Obviously, that would be very inefficient. So they're very smart. They send out scouts, and the scouts go in all directions, and they find good places. The problem is when you have at least two scouts, that come back and say, I found the best place. No, I found the best place. And then there's a really dramatic moment where the colony can actually split. But a colony of social insects that splits, it's a much weaker colony because they constantly compete with other things and other colonies. And so that's definitely an outcome that they don't want. And so what they end up doing is they get the scouts to fight with each other. So they have cross-inhibitory interactions between the disagreeing scouts, and after they've fought it out, they go with the winner. The one that is the last one standing is the one that takes them to the right location. So in general, and these are the kinds of models that we make, it's not just about division of labor. Social systems always have to navigate a diversity of environmental challenges, and they will require different things. They will require times when everybody is with everybody else, and they will have times when they can all be separate, doing different things. So in principle, all right. So until now, I hope I've convinced you that in some sense, so at least this is one of the leads that we are pursuing right now, is that social success rests in large part on the interplay between the types of mechanisms available for self-organizing, the group size, and the structure of the information flow. And these three things are not necessarily static and not necessarily independent, right? So they can change dynamically and interdependently, not just over evolutionary time, but even over the growth of a colony, even right now. So in some sense, social systems are to me, ultimate complex adaptive systems. And so, that's probably one of the reasons I like to study them. And so what about us? Well, we have population growth, both continuous and in spurts. We certainly, our information access and structure have changed, because from the, even existing tribes like the Punan Batu in Borneo, who communicate by leaving leaves with messages on sticks, to, a small scale community, to, obviously that has changed. And not just that has changed, but that has changed too. Right? And so now the landscape of information, we have lots of it. It's carved out in various different ways. The complexity of it is quite hard to capture even in models, though we try to tease it apart in some ways. And so because of that, there is a lot of discussion recently about whether human culture is on the cusp of another major evolutionary transition. Like once you throw in there AI, and you throw in there not just social media, but again AI and these large language models and machine learning and whatnot, what is next, right? And brain chips in brains and other things. Can that be? And so one of the, there are groups where, people are trying to come together from different disciplines, trying to bring tools from how we study these emergent properties in other societies and see whether there are some sort of singularities that one can somehow anticipate. But the last thing that I want to leave you with here is that the thing that I perhaps, I am most exhausted by when it comes to information these days is that it's too much, too cheap, too fast. It's there all the time. And again, as I said, these are really complicated topics, but one of the things that you can ask is, what does this do to our social interactions? Just knowing so much, being able to know so much about anybody almost any time, right? If any of you have a Twitter account, I can go there, and to the extent that you have exposed your views there, then I can know everything you have thought and said over the last 10 years, right? Now it's all available. I don't even need to memorize it. It has no cognitive cost for me to create a free Twitter account and go and get that information, right? And so we wanted to look at a simple test. One of the things that happens as societies get larger is that you can't cooperate by simply having friendly relations with your neighbors. You need to rely on something else, like a social status cue, and those are such as reputations. And we wanted to ask what happens to the evolution of reputation and to the evolution of cooperation in an information-abundant world. There's so much of it. And this is a very simple message. The paper just came out today. If anyone is interested, or yesterday, to read more of this information. But the results can be summarized with this really simple plot. Imagine that I have any number of observations. I want to decide whether I should cooperate with Flavio or what I should think about him. I can make as many observations as I want of him, and they're all free, no cost. And then what I have is some sort of, again, a threshold it's my own personal threshold of how much I decide to forgive. How many of those interactions do I need to look like the way I would have thought about the world versus, how many are kind of a little bit different and then, but I am willing to forgive them, right? We all have such thresholds, right? You have those moments where you're like, this person is kind of like this, but generally fine. And then one day you're like, oh my God, this person is terrible. That's happening a lot these days. Anyway, if you do that and you let individuals evolve, and what they need to evolve is they can evolve to use as much of the information and be as forgiving or as strict as they can possibly want, and they move in this infinite space of information, what we find is that evolution pushes you to use some information, but very little. So you should make a few observations. I should look at Flavio a couple of times, but not more than a couple of times. And I should actually be pretty forgiving. Anything outside of this bubble completely destabilizes the world for very different reasons. Too much of the information and being too strict, I will definitely find something that I don't, you are super wonderful, so I don't know if I'll find something. But, if you look a million times, I might, right? If you're too tolerant, then you get invaded by other strategies, right, that take advantage of you. And so in principle, we find this really simple result, and this is consistent with what social scientists had found, that actually people, when presented with a lot of information about others, they tend to discard a lot of it. So that's fine. Look twice, forgive once, right? A very positive message. The problem is, what do you look at? Do I look at only two things, but I pick the topic on which I look, right? So how actually, we might have been evolved for a really long time to actually discard a lot of the information and to even be quite tolerant. But the problem is these days that all of the information is available there. And if I am somehow able to say, well, I'm only going to look at political beliefs of someone, and then I'm going to make a decision, right? Then those two observations are not just random observations of someone's history. They are more targeted, right? And that can lead to also to collapse. With that optimistic message, I don't have any more wisdom to impart, so thank you all, and thanks my students are there in orange and all of my wonderful collaborators.